Hello again, and welcome to the third part of topic 2.2, communities and ecosystems. Obviously, we've looked at these main ideas before, so we're looking at the interactions of species within their environment, but particularly in this, we're looking how feeding relationships and food webs and food chains can be affected by pollutants. So the main topics inside this subtopic that we're looking at is actually bioaccumulation and something called biomagnification. So let's start with bioaccumulation. Well, bioaccumulation is persistent and non-biodegradable pollutants that can't be broken down, i.e. synthesized, and these can build up in the tissues, organs and cells of organisms. So there's a range of pollutants that when they enter the ecosystem, they actually end up inside the organism. And our first example of this is something that we looked at in topic 1, which meant, and we sort of looked at this in a little bit in the light of bioaccumulation, but we're going to look at it in more detail, which is peregrine falcons. So DDT is a chemical that was used since the 1940s and widely used as a pesticide. And in the 1960s, a researcher called Derek Radcliffe in the UK was able to demonstrate that DDT was actually causing the eggshells of peregrine falcons to become very, very thin. And this was causing a drop in the numbers of peregrine falcons. What Derek Radcliffe had concluded was that by eating mice and voles, the peregrine falcons were actually absorbing the DDT into their own system, and it was building up, it was accumulating, and it was accumulating to such an amount that it was actually disrupting their ability to actually make eggshells. If you look at the graph, it shows that in the 1930s it was quite an active population of peregrine falcons, but by 1963 that had dropped by almost 200 breeding pairs. In the mid-1960s, because of the research of Derek Radcliffe and other people, the use of DDT in developing nations was actually banned. And you can see that from the 1970s onwards, the population of peregrine falcons has recovered dramatically. There's now almost twice as many peregrine falcons in the United Kingdom as there was before. So that's a natural system that was being affected by this idea of bioaccumulation. But bioaccumulation doesn't only just affect natural systems, it can actually affect human systems. And we all know about the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland. Well, the Mad Hatter was actually mad because of mercury poisoning. In the 19th century, to make top hats smooth, because they were made from beaver skins and beaver felt, they actually used mercury in the process, and that was absorbed through the skin of the hatters and eventually got into their brains and built up in the brain. One of the reasons being is that the mercury actually likes and easily attaches itself to the fat tissue, and the brain is one of the fattiest areas inside the body. It's the organ with the most fat inside our bodies. So bioaccumulation is the accumulation of these pollutants, these persistent and non-biodegradable pollutants, in an organism or actually in an entire trophic level. So we get a process where a build-up can actually be increased in a trophic level, and that's a slight shift. That's a process called biomagnification. So let's have a look at this process of biomagnification. So biomagnification is an increase in the concentration of these persistent or non-biodegradable pollutants along the food chain. So we're going to concentrate again on an Arctic ecosystem. Through weather patterns and climate cycles, pollutants actually end up over the Arctic, and they fall as rain onto the ground. Now, the lichen, which is the main source of food for the reindeer, they absorb a small amount of particles. And the reindeer then eat lichen, and they eat a lot of lichen, so they're actually absorbing a bigger number of particles. And so you get an accumulation in their trophic level. But the wolf actually has to eat a lot of flesh, and these particles are trapped inside the flesh, so you end up with a build-up in the particles inside the wolf community. So Canadian researchers found that these things called persistent organic pollutants, the concentration of them dramatically increase along the food chain, and you've got low levels of them inside the lichen, a greater concentration inside the reindeer, and a much bigger concentration inside the wolf. we can think of that in terms of biomass, what's happening with the biomass. So as biomass decreases along the food chain, so we've got a bigger biomass of lichen than we have of the wolf at the end, we actually have a lower concentration of these pollutants inside the first trophic level, and we get an increase in concentration as the biomass or energy in a food chain actually decreases, and that just follows the laws of thermodynamics if you think about it. Yeah, so have a think on that. Why have we got this increase in concentration up the food chain with decrease in biomass? So we've got a concentration effect, a magnification. So let's have a look at an example in reality, again one that affected not only ecosystems but affected people. This is quite a famous one. So Minamata is a small factory town in Japan. It's really dominated by one factory, the Chiso factory, and they make photochemical based substances from fertilizers and to plastics. And so between 1932 and 1968 they dumped about 27 tons of mercury into Minamata Bay. The mercury was absorbed by algae. The algae was then eaten by shrimp. The shrimp were eaten by fish, and the fish were then fished out by the local fishermen and were actually absorbed in the human food chain. So there's a little diagram to show what's happening, but because the diagram was quite crowded, I've left out the shrimp, but the fish are eating the shrimp. Okay, so this is the actual process that happened. So some of the bacteria, the algae, can change mercury into something called methyl mercury, and methyl mercury is easily absorbed into the body of small organisms such as shrimp. The shrimp are then eaten by the fish, and the methyl mercury enters the fish. It doesn't get broken down in the fish and easily stays in their body for a long time, and then gets passed along the food chain as the fish are actually fished out and eaten by men. So the more shrimp that the fish eat, the greater the accumulation, the bioaccumulation of this methyl mercury. The same increase in concentration happens when people eat the fish, and so people around the bay actually started developing mercury poisoning. They weren't getting directly from the factory, they were actually getting it from the mercury that the factory had been dumping into the water. And again, it's a classic case, and if you go back to topic 1, it actually is one of the drivers and effectors on the environmental movement. The pollutants of Minamata Bay are quite a famous story. So go back to topic 1.5 and go and have a look at the information on there as well. So inside this, what have we done? So the works cited. So I've used information, obviously I've used Alice in Wonderland, and most of what I've put in there has actually come from the research of Derek Radcliffe. There are other bits, but the other bits are also in your textbook and now quite commonly known stories, so there's less of a need to cite the original material. And for some extended resources that will help on this, if you follow this link, there's actually a really good story about how mercury is actually still accumulating in Arctic food chains and actually affecting polar bears and their metabolisms. So there we go, that's it for now. Thanks for listening, and hopefully that was useful, and tune back in for another topic within ecosystems and ecology.